Welcome to Caveman Sleep Stories. If you're here tonight, you're likely searching for rest, seeking to quiet the mind and drift gently toward the sleep that feels just beyond reach. Tonight, we're exploring something curious, something that seems almost impossible when you first hear it. People who lived tens of thousands of years ago, people who never had flashlights, never knew electric lights, never carried any modern illumination, moved through complete darkness with confidence and certainty that modern people cannot imagine, not just stumbling carefully, but navigating reliably, traveling miles in pitch blackness, finding their way home without hesitation or fear. It's a puzzle that challenges what we assume about human capability, especially when we consider how helpless modern people feel in true darkness, reaching immediately for phone screens and flashlights. Yet our ancestors walked confidently through moonless nights without any artificial aid. How could they navigate when vision provided almost nothing? What senses and skills allowed movement through darkness that seems impenetrable to us? We'll discover the dark adapted vision that developed over 30 to 45 minutes of patient waiting, the hearing that detected sounds from 3 to 4 times farther than modern ears manage, the bare feet that read the ground like text, the mental maps more accurate than GPS, the integration of smell and temperature and wind that created complete awareness even when eyes could barely see. If you drift off while listening, that's exactly what should happen. Consider subscribing if these stories help you find rest, and there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description if you'd like to support this channel. A like helps others discover these sleep stories too. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back to a time when darkness was navigable without any artificial light, and discover what ancient people knew through their senses and practice that we've somehow forgotten. The fire has burned down to coals, the flames that danced and leaped against the shelter walls now reduced to a gentle pulsing glow, red and orange embers breathing slowly, casting barely enough light to outline the shapes of sleeping bodies arranged around the fire pit, faces peaceful in rest, breath rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep. Outside the shelter entrance, beyond the circle of fading firelight, darkness waits, complete and absolute, the kind of darkness that exists on nights when the moon has not yet risen, when clouds cover the stars, when the world seems to have vanished into a blackness so total that modern people, emerging from their brightly lit homes into such conditions, would stop immediately, would reach for flashlights or phone screens, would feel a rising sense of disorientation and vulnerability, a primal fear of the unknown that surrounds them. But here, in this shelter, in this time, someone stirs from sleep, sits up slowly, careful not to disturb the others, and begins to move toward the entrance with a purpose that speaks of intention rather than emergency, of routine rather than crisis. No fumbling occurs, no hands reach out blindly, grasping for reference points in panic. The figure moves between sleeping bodies with precise steps, feet finding the narrow spaces between furs and flesh, with the certainty of someone who knows exactly where everyone is positioned, who carries a mental map of this small space so complete that darkness changes nothing about the ability to navigate it. One hand touches the stone wall briefly as the figure passes the shelter's main support post, not groping for stability but simply confirming position through tactile reference, the way someone might touch a familiar doorframe in passing, an unconscious gesture of spatial awareness rather than need. At the entrance, the figure pauses, standing in the threshold where the last traces of firelight end and true darkness begins, and for a long moment there is only stillness, only the act of standing and breathing while something important happens, something that modern people almost never experience and therefore can barely imagine, something that takes time and patience and the willingness to wait in darkness without reaching for artificial light to banish it. The eyes are adjusting, not quickly, not all at once, but gradually, progressively, through a series of chemical and neurological changes that transform what vision means, that alter what the eye can perceive and how the brain processes visual information, changes that happen automatically when darkness persists, when the retina is given time to respond to the absence of light, rather than being constantly reset by the presence of it. In the modern world, this adjustment almost never completes. People move from lit interiors to lit streets. They carry flashlights when camping. They turn on bedroom lights to navigate hallways at night. Every exposure to bright light resets the adaptation process, starting the countdown over, ensuring that true dark adaptation never occurs, that the eye never achieves its full potential for low-light vision, that people remain functionally blind in conditions where, given time, they could see quite well. But here, now, there is no artificial light, no switch to flip, no battery-powered device to illuminate the path. Just patience, just waiting, just allowing the transformation to happen at its own pace, which is not fast, which requires dedication and trust that the wait will be worthwhile, that vision will return in a different form, that the darkness will reveal itself as less absolute than it first appeared. The changes begin in the retina, in the light-sensitive tissue that lines the back of the eye, where two types of photoreceptor cells exist side by side, but serve very different functions and respond to very different conditions. The cones, concentrated in the center of the retina, in the fovea where visual detail is sharpest, are responsible for daylight vision, for color perception, for the ability to see fine details and read small print and recognize faces from across a clearing. These cones work beautifully in bright light, providing the rich, detailed, colorful vision that people think of as simply seeing, the normal experience of the visual world. But cones need substantial light to function. As brightness decreases below certain thresholds, cones begin to fail, to provide less and less information until finally they stop functioning altogether, leaving the center of vision dark and useless, creating the sensation of blindness that modern people experience when they step from lighted spaces into darkness without waiting for adaptation. But the retina contains other photoreceptors, the rods, millions of them, distributed across the entire retina but concentrated in the periphery, away from the central fovea, designed and refined over millions of years of evolution to detect light at extremely low levels, to function in conditions where cones are useless, to provide a different kind of vision that sacrifices color and fine detail in exchange for extraordinary sensitivity to dim light and movement. In daylight, in bright conditions, the rods are overwhelmed, saturated with light, bleached by brightness, and they contribute little to vision while the cones dominate. But in darkness, given time, the rods transform. Chemical changes occur. Rhodopsin, the light-sensitive pigment that fills the rods, regenerates after being bleached by brightness, rebuilds itself in the darkness, increasing in concentration until the rods become exquisitely sensitive, capable of responding to individual photons of light, capable of detecting illumination levels thousands of times dimmer than the threshold where cones cease to function. This transformation doesn't happen instantly. The first few minutes in darkness bring some improvement. The most severely bleached photopigments begin to recover. Vision improves from total blindness to dim awareness of very bright objects or light sources. But this is just the beginning. After 10 minutes, more substantial changes have occurred. Objects begin to emerge from the darkness. Shapes become barely visible, but the transformation is far from complete. After 20 minutes, vision has improved dramatically, but still hasn't reached its full potential. The rods are still rebuilding their photopigment stores, still increasing their sensitivity. After 30 minutes, vision has become quite functional in what seemed like complete darkness. Large objects are clearly visible. Movement is easily detected. Navigation becomes possible. But even now, the adaptation isn't finished. It continues for 45 minutes, sometimes longer, until finally the rods have achieved their maximum sensitivity, until the eye has transformed completely from a daylight instrument into a night vision device, sacrificing the color and detail that daylight provides in exchange for the ability to see by starlight alone, to navigate in conditions that provide only a few photons per second to the dark adapted retina, to function in darkness so complete that modern people, arriving in it suddenly from lighted environments, would declare it impossible to see anything at all. And they would be right, in a sense. Without adaptation, without waiting, without allowing the rods to transform, such darkness is functionally impenetrable. But with adaptation, with patience, with the willingness to wait in darkness while the eyes adjust, vision returns, different from daylight vision but sufficient, functional, reliable enough to allow confident movement through familiar terrain. The figure standing in the shelter entrance has been waiting, standing still or moving very slowly while the adaptation occurs, and now, after the necessary time has passed, the darkness outside is no longer absolute. Shapes emerge. The familiar outline of the large pine tree that stands 20 paces from the shelter entrance, its trunk a darker vertical form against the slightly lighter darkness of the cloudy night sky behind it. The path that leads down from the shelter toward the valley, visible as a line of subtly different darkness, worn earth reflecting what little light exists differently than the surrounding vegetation, creating a contrast that the dark adapted eye can perceive even though the difference is so slight that measurements with modern instruments might detect only a few percent variation in brightness. The general topography of the hillside, slopes visible as gradations of darkness, higher ground slightly lighter against the sky, lower ground darker. The overall shape of the landscape readable even without detail, sufficient for orientation and navigation. This is not daylight vision. Colors are gone. Blues and greens and reds all rendered into shades of gray. Fine details are lost. The texture of bark on the pine tree is not visible from this distance. Individual needles cannot be seen, but the tree itself is clearly present. Its location known, its shape familiar, enough information to navigate past it without collision, to use it as a landmark, confirming position and direction. And more importantly, movement is visible with extraordinary clarity. If a deer were standing motionless near the tree, it might not be clearly seen, might blend into the darkness enough to be missed by casual observation. But the moment it moved, the moment it shifted position or turned its head or took a step, the motion would be instantly visible, detected by the peripheral rods that excel at movement perception, that respond so quickly to changes in the visual field that moving objects seem to pop into visibility even when stationary objects remain barely perceptible. This dark adapted vision provides the first layer of navigational ability in darkness, the foundation on which all other sensory information builds. But it is far from the only sense being used, far from the only source of information that makes confident movement through darkness possible. The figure steps out of the shelter and begins walking down the path toward the valley, feet finding the trail with certainty, body moving with steady confidence, and immediately other senses begin contributing information, adding to the sparse visual data, creating a complete picture of the environment that is richer and more reliable than vision alone could provide even in much brighter conditions. Hearing sharpens, not through any physical change in the ears themselves, which remain structurally identical in darkness and light, but through a shift in attention and neural processing, the brain allocating more resources to auditory processing when visual input decreases, extracting more information from the same sounds that were present but less attended to in daylight. The stream in the valley below, which could be heard faintly from the shelter during the day, a background murmur easily ignored while visual information dominated awareness, now sounds clearer, louder, not in absolute volume, but in perceptual prominence, the brain highlighting it as important information, processing its characteristics in greater detail, extracting meaning from subtle variations in the sound. The gurgle and splash reveal not just that water is flowing, but how fast it's flowing, over what kind of substrate, whether the level is high or low, whether the stream is the familiar watercourse visited hundreds of times before, or whether something about its sound has changed in ways that might indicate flooding or unusual drought. This is not conscious analysis. The sound is simply heard, and its meaning is understood automatically, the way a fluent reader understands written words without consciously parsing grammar and syntax, the meaning arriving whole and immediate rather than being constructed through deliberate interpretation. The sound of the stream provides directional information, a beacon in the darkness that locates the valley floor relative to the current position on the hillside, but it provides more than just its own location. It creates an acoustic environment, a soundscape that reveals the shape of the terrain through the way sound behaves in this particular place. Sound travels differently over open ground than through forest. It reflects off rock faces and cliff walls, creating echoes that reveal the presence and location of solid barriers. It is absorbed by dense vegetation, deadened and muffled by pine needles and leaves, and the soft organic matter of the forest floor. The experienced ear learns to read these acoustic signatures, to interpret the behavior of sound as information about space and structure, to build a mental model of the environment from auditory data alone. Walking down the trail, the figure hears the stream ahead and below, but also hears the quality of its sound, the way it reaches the ear directly in some moments and with a subtle echo in others, revealing that the rock outcrop on the eastern side of the valley is reflecting some of the stream sound back toward the trail, creating a slightly more complex acoustic pattern than would exist if the valley walls were uniformly vegetated. This echo is not obvious. It doesn't announce itself as a distinct repetition of the original sound. It simply adds a quality to the total sound, a slight richness or resonance that someone familiar with this location recognizes unconsciously, that confirms the expected acoustic environment, that reassures through its familiarity that position and orientation are correct, that the mental map corresponds to reality. Hearing in darkness becomes not just more important but fundamentally transformed, the brain devoting more processing power to auditory information when visual input diminishes, allowing the detection of sounds from 3 to 4 times farther away than modern people typically manage to hear them. Not because the physical structure of the ear has changed, not because sound waves travel farther in darkness than in daylight, but because attention, practice, and neural processing create perceptual abilities that modern people never develop or have allowed to atrophy through disuse and lack of necessity. The sounds of water, of streams and rivers, and even the subtle drip of springs seeping from rock faces carry through night air for remarkable distances, sometimes a mile or more depending on terrain and atmospheric conditions, providing constant acoustic reference points that locate the listener relative to known water sources that appear on the mental maps built through years of repeated travel across familiar territory. These water sounds are not just present or absent. They carry information about direction and distance. A stream heard directly ahead sounds different from a stream heard to the left or right. The quality changes. The way both ears receive the sound changes, creating the sense of directionality that allows navigation toward or away from water sources, even when they're too far away to see even with dark adapted eyes. even when terrain blocks direct line of sight, even when multiple turns in a trail might seem to disorient someone who's relying on memory of visual landmarks alone. The water sound persists, constant, reliable, updating continuously as position changes, as the angle to the water source shifts, as distance decreases or increases, providing feedback that confirms successful navigation or reveals the need for correction. But water sounds are not the only acoustic information available in the darkness. The wind moving through vegetation creates distinctive signatures that vary with plant type, with density, with moisture content. The rustle of grass differs from the whisper of leaves, from the creak of branches, from the rattle of seed pods, from the particular sound that wind makes moving through pine needles versus the sound it makes in deciduous forest versus the sound of open grassland. Someone who has lived in this landscape since birth, who has heard these sounds in all seasons and all conditions, recognizes them automatically, identifies locations and habitat types by their acoustic character even when vision provides nothing, even when the darkness is so complete that the dark adapted eye can barely distinguish land from sky. Walk through forest, and the sound of wind has a particular quality, muffled and complex, coming from above where wind moves through the canopy, from all directions as it filters through trunks and branches at multiple levels. Emerge into a clearing, and the sound changes immediately, becomes more open, more direct. Wind now moving across ground-level vegetation without the complexity of forest structure. And this change announces the transition between habitats as clearly as visual observation would in daylight, allowing navigation that follows or avoids open spaces, that seeks or evades forest cover, that chooses routes based on terrain type, even when that terrain cannot be clearly seen. The acoustic environment is rich with information, with patterns and signatures that the experienced ear reads fluently, and in darkness, when visual information decreases, this acoustic reading becomes proportionally more important, more attended to, more central to the task of understanding where the body is in space and how to move through that space successfully. Echo patterns, created by voice or footfalls bouncing back from rock faces, cliff walls, dense forest edges, or the open space of clearings, reveal the shape and scale of the surrounding environment, functioning as a natural form of echolocation that doesn't require the specialized clicks and calls that bats and dolphins use, but works through ordinary sounds of movement and speech, the returning echoes painting an acoustic picture of space that the experienced listener reads as automatically as the eye reads visual information in light, creating a sense of the surroundings' geometry and scale that guides movement through what seems to the uninitiated like featureless darkness. Walk toward a cliff face in darkness, and the sound of footsteps, the sound of breathing, the sound of any vocalization begins to return as echo before the cliff is visible, before the dark adapted eye has distinguished the darker vertical surface from the general darkness around it. And this echo warns of the barrier ahead, reveals its distance through the delay between original sound and echo return, reveals its size through the strength and persistence of the echo, reveals its surface character through the quality of the reflected sound, whether it's a hard echo from bare stone or a softer echo from a surface covered with vegetation or fractured into multiple echoing surfaces that create a more diffuse return. This acoustic sensing of space is not usually conscious. The echo is not heard as a distinct repetition of the original sound requiring analysis and interpretation. It simply adds to the total acoustic environment, to the sense of what kind of space surrounds the body, whether it's open or enclosed, whether there are nearby surfaces, whether movement is happening in a valley bottom with reflecting walls or on an exposed ridge, where sound travels away into open space with no return. And this sensing can be enhanced deliberately when needed. Clap hands sharply, or call out, or snap fingers, creating a sound specifically to generate echoes. And the returns map the immediate surroundings in greater detail, revealing the distance to the rock face on the left, to the forest edge ahead, to the open space on the right, building a momentary acoustic picture that updates the mental map, that confirms or corrects the assumed position. The night is not silent. Animals move through the darkness with their own purposes, their own needs, and their movements create sounds that provide additional information, additional landmarks in the acoustic landscape. Large herbivores browsing, deer or bison, or the occasional mammoth in other territories, make sounds of movement and feeding that carry surprising distances in still night air. Rustling vegetation, snapping small branches, the heavy footfalls of large bodies moving across the ground. Predators generally move more quietly, but they too create detectable sounds when they hunt or travel. The padding of feet, the scrape of claws on stone, the occasional vocalization, the low growl or grunt that maintains contact between pack members or warns competitors away from kills. Small animals are everywhere in darkness, mice and voles and rabbits, and though individually quiet, collectively they create a texture of small sounds, rustlings and squeaks and the patter of tiny feet that indicates the presence of vegetated areas, of good ground cover, of habitat types that support these populations. Birds settling for the night, shifting position on branches, occasionally calling, mark the presence of trees suitable for roosting, of areas where aerial predators might hunt, of boundaries between different habitat types. All of these animal sounds, layered together with water sounds and wind sounds and echoes, create an acoustic environment so rich with information that someone practiced in reading it navigates with confidence, even when visibility is nearly zero, even when clouds obscure all stars and the moon has not yet risen, even when the darkness seems absolute to someone whose ears have never learned to extract meaning from the subtle and complex soundscape of the living night. And this acoustic awareness is not limited to identifying what makes each sound. Direction matters, distance matters, change matters. An animal sound heard ahead and to the left locates that animal in space, updates the mental map with this temporary landmark, provides information about where other animals are moving, and therefore where a human might want to go or avoid going. An animal sound that was distant and becomes closer indicates approach, suggests whether the encounter might be dangerous, whether a predator is hunting nearby, whether a large herbivore might need to be given space. Animal sounds that cease suddenly indicate disturbance, suggest that something has alarmed the local wildlife, might indicate the presence of another human or a large predator, trigger increased alertness and careful assessment of the situation before continuing movement. The trail descends the hillside in a familiar path, and underfoot, the character of the ground provides yet another stream of information, another sense contributing to navigation, creating redundancy and confirmation that makes the combination of multiple senses far more reliable than any single sense could be alone. Feet, bare or covered only with minimal hide wrappings that preserve sensitivity while providing protection from stone and cold, feel the ground continuously with every step, detecting texture, temperature, firmness, moisture, the countless subtle variations that distinguish one surface from another, that mark specific locations as distinctly as visual landmarks mark them in daylight. The modern foot, encased from early childhood in rigid shoes with thick soles that separate foot from ground, loses this sensitivity almost entirely. becomes merely a support structure rather than a sense organ, provides information only about whether the ground is level or sloped, hard or soft, but transmits nothing of the rich textural detail that barefoot or minimally shod feet perceive and interpret automatically. Walk barefoot for months, for years, as everyone does here, and the feet transform, developing thick protective skin on the sole while simultaneously maintaining and even enhancing the density of nerve endings that allow tactile perception, creating feet that are simultaneously tougher and more sensitive than the soft, tender, shoe-dependent feet of modern people who can barely walk across a gravel driveway without pain and who receive almost no navigational information from the ground beneath them. The bare foot feels temperature differences immediately. This is not trivial information. Temperature reveals much about ground composition and recent history. The path itself, compressed by thousands of footfalls over many seasons, absorbs and retains heat differently than the looser, more vegetated ground on either side of it. During the day it warms in the sun. At night it cools but remains slightly warmer than the surrounding earth because its compressed surface holds the day's heat longer, releases it more slowly, creating a temperature differential that the sole of the foot detects instantly, that marks the path as clearly as if it were painted a different color. This temperature difference persists for hours after sunset, fading gradually as the night progresses, but remaining perceptible for much of the night, particularly on paths that see heavy use, that have been compressed and compacted and cleared of insulating vegetation through constant traffic. Texture varies even more than temperature. Bare earth has a particular feel, slightly gritty, firm but not hard, familiar and comfortable under the foot. Stone feels different, harder, often smoother if worn by weather or water, cooler to the touch, solid and unyielding. Sand creates another sensation entirely, shifting under weight, conforming to the contours of the sole, recognizable instantly as sand even in absolute darkness, even if the location hadn't been known beforehand. Clay, when present, feels sticky when wet, hard and cracked when dry, distinctive in either state, marking specific locations where clay deposits exist. Gravel provides yet another tactile signature, small stones pressing into the sole, painful if sharp, merely uncomfortable if rounded, unmistakable as gravel, regardless of visibility. Vegetation underfoot changes the texture completely, grass providing cushioning and moisture, moss creating softness, and the particular squeaky feel that moss has when compressed. Fallen leaves adding crackle and rustle, and the organic smell of decay, pine needles creating a slippery surface, and the sharp scent of resin. Each of these textures is learned through experience, through thousands of footsteps across varying terrain, through the continuous feedback that rises from every contact between soul and earth, building a mental library of tactile sensations that correspond to locations and conditions, that allow the feet to read the ground like a text, interpreting every sensation as information about where the body is and what kind of surface it's traversing. Walk this trail often enough, and certain sections develop distinctive tactile signatures. The section where roots cross the path, creating regular bumps spaced predictably, unmistakable once learned. The section where water flows across the trail seasonally, leaving a depression that becomes muddy in rain, that feels different from the higher, drier sections above and below it. The section where stone outcrops, where the path crosses bare rock for several paces before returning to earth, the hard coolness of stone marking this location as clearly as any visual landmark. The memory of this stone crossing so embedded in the mental map that feet anticipate it before arriving, already preparing for the texture change, for the different traction, for the smooth surface that requires slightly different foot placement to avoid slipping. The trail descends through a section where the vegetation changes, and this transition is felt through the feet before it's seen, even by eyes adapted to darkness. The hillside above the shelter grows mostly pine, the ground beneath the trees covered with a thick mat of needles that makes walking quiet and slightly slippery, that smells of resin and organic decay, that feels consistent and uniform underfoot except where roots surface or stone outcrops. But partway down the hillside, the forest composition changes. Fewer pines, more deciduous trees that drop their leaves in the cold season. The ground cover changes correspondingly. Less pine needle mat, more accumulated leaves that crunch and rustle unless thoroughly dampened by rain, that compress into soft layers over time, that feel different from pine needles, less slippery, more crumbly, creating a distinct texture that announces the transition between forest types, even when visibility is insufficient to distinguish pine from deciduous trees visually. This textural change marks a known position on the trail. The point where deciduous forest begins is perhaps a third of the way from the shelter to the stream. Reach this point, and the mental map updates automatically. Position is confirmed. Expected time to reach the stream is calculated unconsciously, based on the remaining distance and the known characteristics of the trail section still ahead. No conscious thought is required. The feet feel the change. The mind recognizes it. The navigation continues with increased certainty, with confirmation that progress matches expectations, that the route is correct, that the darkness has not caused disorientation, despite the limited visual information available. Temperature provides information beyond marking the trail itself. Air temperature varies with terrain and position, creating thermal gradations that the skin detects automatically, that provide additional navigational cues that combine with visual, auditory, and tactile information to create complete environmental awareness. Descending from the hillside toward the valley floor, the air grows progressively cooler, not dramatically, not in a way that causes discomfort or requires adjusting clothing, but perceptibly, noticeably, the temperature dropping perhaps several degrees over the course of the descent, enough to be felt clearly on the face where thermal sensitivity is greatest, where the concentration of thermoreceptors in facial skin detects temperature changes of less than 1 degree. This cooling happens for multiple reasons that combine to create a reliable gradient. Cold air, denser than warm air, sinks, pools in low places, collects in valley bottoms, creating temperature inversions where the valley floor might be significantly cooler than the hillsides above it. This is not theory or occasional phenomenon. It's reliable, consistent, predictable, happening every calm night when the daily temperature cycle follows its normal pattern. Water increases the cooling effect. Streams and rivers, cold from springs or snowmelt, lower the temperature of the air immediately above and around them, creating a zone of cooler air that extends outward from the water for considerable distances, particularly in calm conditions when breezes don't mix the air, when the cold layer sits stable and undisturbed. Walk toward water in darkness, and the air cools progressively on the skin. Walk away from water, and it warms slightly. Maintain elevation without approaching or leaving water sources, and the temperature remains relatively constant. This creates a navigational tool, a sense of thermal geography that guides movement even when other senses provide ambiguous information. The goal is to reach the stream. The stream is in the valley bottom. Therefore, the air should cool as descent continues. Feel the air cooling on the face, on the hands, on any exposed skin, and know that direction and progress are correct. Feel the temperature stabilize or warm slightly, and know that something is wrong, that the route has veered uphill or away from water, that correction is needed. This thermal feedback is continuous, constant, updating moment by moment as position changes, as distance to water decreases, as elevation changes, providing guidance that requires no conscious interpretation, that simply informs the navigation naturally, automatically, the way proprioception informs balance without requiring thought. The wind provides its own form of directional reference, and tonight a gentle breeze moves across the valley from the west, not strong enough to be uncomfortable, barely noticeable in daylight when other sensory information dominates, but clearly perceptible in darkness when attention to subtle environmental cues increases. The prevailing winds in this territory blow from the west during this season, shifting somewhat in other times of the year but maintaining this general westerly tendency throughout the cooler months. And this creates a reliable compass, a constant directional reference that requires no observation of stars or sun, that functions equally well in overcast darkness as in clear conditions. Feel the wind on the left cheek while walking north toward the stream, on the face while walking west, on the right cheek while walking south, on the back of the neck while walking east. This is not complicated navigation. It requires no instruments, no measurements, no calculations, just attention to the simple direct sensation of air movement against skin and the knowledge, built from years of living in this place, of which direction the wind typically comes from at this time of year. If the wind shifts, if unusual weather brings southerly or easterly winds, the change is noticed immediately, not as disorienting confusion, but as interesting information, as something to note and remember, as weather data that might predict the coming of storms or seasonal changes. But on normal nights, on typical weather patterns, the westerly wind is as reliable as the position of the North Star, and far more continuously accessible since wind can be felt at any time, while stars require breaks in cloud cover and open sky above. Wind provides more than just direction. It carries information, scent information, temperature information, moisture information, all of these layered together, creating a complex stream of data that the experienced interpreter reads continuously, extracting meaning almost unconsciously, the way fluent readers extract meaning from text without noticing individual letters. Smell travels on the wind, and the nose, often dismissed in modern life as the least important sense, as a vestigial remnant of earlier evolutionary stages when scent mattered more, proves remarkably capable when given attention and practice, when not overwhelmed by the artificial fragrances and pollutants that modern environments contain, when allowed to function in natural contexts where meaningful scents exist to be detected and interpreted. The smell of water carries on the wind long before water is visible or audible, particularly in dry conditions when moisture stands out against the generally dry air, when the distinctive scent of dampness, of wet stone and moist earth and growing vegetation announces the presence of water from remarkable distances, sometimes a quarter mile or more when wind direction is favorable, when the breeze flows steadily from water toward the person detecting it. This is not a subtle effect requiring extraordinary olfactory sensitivity. Anyone with a functioning nose, given practice and attention, can detect water by scent from substantial distances, particularly in landscapes where water sources are limited and therefore particularly valuable, where knowing the location of every stream and spring and seasonal pool might mean the difference between easy access to drinking water and a long, thirsty search. The smell of water is not uniform. Different water sources have different scents. Springs smell mineral and clean, the water emerging from deep underground carrying the scent of stone and earth. Stagnant pools smell organic, sometimes unpleasant, the scent of algae and decay indicating water that might be drinkable in necessity but is better avoided if alternatives exist. Fast-moving streams smell fresh, clean, the turbulent flow oxygenating the water, preventing the organic buildup that creates the smell of stagnation. And particular water sources, visited repeatedly over years, develop recognizable scent signatures, combinations of mineral content and surrounding vegetation and substrate that make each stream or spring distinctive, that allow identification not just of water somewhere ahead, but of this specific stream that runs through the valley bottom, the one with the willow trees on its banks, and the clay deposits that color it slightly brown in spring floods. The wind carries animal scents as well, and these provide information about what creatures are active nearby, about what dangers or opportunities exist in the surrounding darkness, about what has passed through this area recently and might therefore have left tracks or kills or other signs that daylight will reveal. Large herbivores, deer and bison and others, have distinctive scents that carry far on favorable winds that announce their presence before any sound or sight confirms it, that allow hunters to locate prey or travelers, to avoid disturbing herds or individuals, to assess whether predators might be attracted to the area by the presence of potential prey. Predators themselves can sometimes be scented, though they often move with the wind in their favor, positioning themselves downwind of prey, using scent as a hunting tool that helps them approach without detection. But not all predators are equally cautious, and large cats in particular have a strong, distinctive musk that can be detected when wind conditions allow, providing warning of their presence, triggering increased caution and alertness. The scent of death, of kills and carcasses, carries farthest of all. The smell of blood and decay and the distinctive scent of predator feeding sites announcing their presence from remarkable distances. Valuable information that might indicate danger if the kill is fresh, and predators might still be nearby, or opportunity if the kill is older and predators have moved on and scavenging might be possible, or simply information to note and remember, updating the mental map with the knowledge that predators have been hunting in this area recently, that extra caution might be wise, that small children should not wander alone, that camps should be positioned carefully with awareness that dangerous animals are operating nearby. Plant scents also travel on the wind, and while less immediately dramatic than water or animal scents, they provide information about vegetation types and habitat boundaries, about seasonal changes and terrain characteristics. Pine forests smell of resin, particularly in warmer weather when trees are actively growing, when sap flows freely, when the volatile compounds that create the pine scent are released in greater quantities. Deciduous forests smell different, earthier, particularly in the fall when leaves drop and decompose, when the forest floor becomes thick with organic matter, releasing the complex mix of compounds that signal decay and nutrient cycling. Grasslands smell green and fresh when growing, dry and dusty when dormant, the scent changing with season and moisture availability. Flowering plants release fragrances that mark the progression of seasons, that indicate the location of particular plant species, that sometimes attract pollinators but also simply announce their presence to anyone with a nose capable of detecting them. Someone who has lived their entire life in this landscape, who has experienced thousands of seasonal cycles, who has smelled these plants in all their various states of growth and dormancy and reproduction, learns to read plant scents as information about location and season and weather, to detect the subtle transitions between habitat types through smell alone, to navigate in darkness using the scent of plants as confirmation of position, as markers indicating familiar locations, as orientation cues that persist when other forms of information might be ambiguous or absent. The descent continues, feet reading the trail, hands occasionally reaching out to touch familiar trees in passing, not for balance, but for confirmation, for the tactile reassurance that comes from physical contact with known landmarks. the large oak that grows beside the trail, the one with the distinctive rough bark, the one that was already old when the oldest living person was born, that will likely still be here when everyone currently alive has passed. The hand touches it in passing, feels the familiar texture, confirms position. This is the oak that marks the middle section of the trail. Above it, the path is steeper, descending rapidly from the shelter. Below it, the slope eases, the trail following more gently descending terrain toward the valley bottom. Touch the oak and know precisely where the body is in space, precisely how much further it is to the stream, precisely what terrain lies ahead. This knowledge is not calculated. It simply exists, present in the mental map that has been built through countless traversals of this path, refined through experience until every feature is known, every landmark is memorized, every distance is calibrated, not through measurement but through embodied knowledge of how many steps, how much time, how much effort is required to traverse each section. Children learn this early, walking with adults, observing, experiencing, building their own mental maps through repetition and guidance. By adolescence, the major trails are known completely. By adulthood, the entire home territory is mapped internally with precision that rivals or exceeds modern maps in terms of practical utility, the mental representation, capturing not just position, but character, not just location, but quality, encoding information about resources and dangers and seasonal changes that paper maps never show, that GPS coordinates cannot capture, that exists only in the experiential knowledge built through direct sensory engagement with the landscape over many years. The trail passes through a section where small stones, river rocks carried up from the stream bed over time, pebbles dropped from feet or clothing or tools, have accumulated, mixing with the compressed earth to create a distinctive surface that feels different from the sections above and below it, that creates a slight roughness under the sole, a subtle gritty texture that marks this location unmistakably. This is the approach to the stream crossing, the section of trail that runs closest to the water, where the ground stays damper from proximity to the stream, where moisture prevents the trail from drying completely even in drought, where small stones accumulate because water sometimes reaches this far during spring floods, carrying sediment and depositing it before receding. The feet recognize this texture immediately, automatically, without conscious analysis. This is the stone section. Therefore, the stream is close. Therefore, the descent is nearly complete. Therefore, the walk is almost done. Navigation confirmed continuously through layers of redundant information, vision, and hearing and touch and smell and temperature and wind, all agreeing, all contributing their piece of the total picture, creating certainty through the convergence of multiple sensory channels that would be less reliable individually, but become extremely reliable when integrated, when processed together, when allowed to confirm and reinforce each other's information. The stream appears, not suddenly, not as a surprise, but as the expected result of following the known trail, as the predictable destination that the mental map indicated would be reached about now, after descending for this long, after passing this sequence of landmarks. Hearing detected it first, many steps ago, the sound growing progressively louder as distance decreased. Temperature confirmed approach, the air cooling as proximity to water increased. Smell added confirmation, the scent of water and wet stone, and the particular vegetation that grows along this stream's banks. And now, vision, dark adapted eyes functioning adequately by starlight, despite the clouds that still obscure most of the sky, perceives the stream as a line of subtly different darkness. Darker where the water flows in shadow, lighter where it moves over pale stones that reflect what little light exists, the pattern of light and dark marking the stream's course as clearly as if painted, sufficient to guide approach, to indicate where the easiest crossing might be, where the banks are lowest, where the footing is firmest. This is not daylight vision. The water itself is barely visible. Its color cannot be determined. Its clarity or turbidity is unknowable without closer inspection, but its presence is clear. Its location is certain. Its form and flow are sufficiently apparent to allow confident approach. Hands reach down toward the water, guided by sound now more than sight, by the gurgle and splash that indicates exactly where the current flows, where water is deep enough to cup, where the cleanest drinking water can be found in the main flow rather than in the quieter edges where sediment settles. The water is cold, not painfully so, not freezing, but significantly cooler than body temperature, the sensation immediate and sharp against the skin of the hands, confirmatory information that this is indeed water, fresh and clean, flowing down from higher elevations where it originated as rainfall or snowmelt days or weeks ago, traveling through this valley on its way to wherever this stream eventually flows, to a river perhaps, or to a lake, or to disappear underground into porous stone, its ultimate destination unknown and unimportant to the immediate task of drinking, of satisfying thirst, of collecting water to carry back to the shelter for morning use. Cupped hands bring water to lips. The taste is familiar, known. This is the same stream that has always flowed through this valley, that was here before anyone currently living was born, that will continue flowing long after they're gone, constant and reliable except during the driest periods of summer when flow decreases or sometimes stops entirely for a few weeks before rains return and restore it. The taste reveals mineral content, the particular combination of dissolved substances that this water contains from flowing through and over the stone and soil of this watershed. Flavor that would allow identification of this stream, even if somehow transported elsewhere and given this water blind without knowledge of location, the way a person might identify a familiar food by taste alone. The flavor distinctive and unique, slightly different from other streams in other valleys, even a few miles away where the underlying geology might be subtly different, where different minerals dissolve into the water, creating different tastes. But this walk is not unique, not unusual, not an extraordinary feat of navigation requiring explanation or commentary. This is simply what happens. This is how people move through their territory, in darkness as in light, using the senses they have, trusting capabilities that modern people rarely develop because modern life eliminates the necessity that would drive their development. Walk familiar ground in darkness enough times, and it becomes natural. Not easy, perhaps, not as effortless as walking the same ground in daylight, but natural, routine, unremarkable. The sort of thing that requires no special preparation, no dramatic build-up, no sense of danger or adventure. Need water in the middle of the night and someone walks down to the stream to get it, navigates back without incident, returns to sleep. The whole expedition taking perhaps the time it takes the moon to move a hand's width across the sky when it's visible. Perhaps a fraction of an hour, perhaps 15 minutes in modern terms. Though time is not thought of in those terms here, is not measured precisely, is simply experienced as however long a task takes, whether that's longer or shorter than expected, whether it's completed before tiredness becomes significant, or whether rest is needed before continuing. The territory that surrounds this shelter extends perhaps 5 miles in any direction, maybe more in some directions where good hunting grounds or productive gathering sites draw people farther, maybe less in directions where terrain is difficult or resources are sparse, or where the territory of other groups begins, and crossing boundaries might cause conflict. 10 miles across, maybe slightly more. not large by modern standards. Modern people drive farther than this daily, walk it casually on hiking trails, would not consider this a substantial territory, would not think 10 miles of movement extraordinary or difficult or even particularly noteworthy. But within this territory, every feature is known, every tree of any significance, every boulder large enough to serve as a landmark, every slope and stream and spring, every dense thicket and open meadow and rocky outcrop, not known through maps, not recorded through coordinates, not measured with instruments, known through direct experience, through walking, through seeing and touching and smelling, through passing by hundreds or thousands of times over a lifetime, through learning these features as a child, walking with parents and older siblings, being shown the important landmarks, the useful resources, the dangers to avoid, through reinforcing that childhood learning with repeated adult travel, with hunting expeditions and gathering trips and visits to other groups, and the endless routine movement that fills the days and weeks and seasons of a life lived entirely within this relatively small area. Mental maps built this way, through experience rather than abstraction, through embodied knowledge rather than symbolic representation, possess characteristics that make them remarkably functional for navigation in darkness. They encode not just position, but quality, not just boulder here, but large rounded boulder with mineral deposits on south side that stay wet, with moss growing in cracks, with overhanging rock that provides shelter from rain, with marks where stone tools have been sharpened against it over generations. Not just stream here, but fast stream with rocky bed, cold water, good for drinking. Deer use this crossing. Willows grow on east bank. Clay deposits on west bank turn water brown after heavy rain, deepest in spring, sometimes dries completely by late summer. The mental map contains layers of information that accumulate over time, that grow richer with each visit, with each seasonal change observed, with each interaction with each location. These maps are not static. They update continuously. The tree that fell last winter, now absent from the expected location, incorporated into the updated map. The new spring that appeared after heavy rains, noted and added. The game trail that animals have worn deeper through heavy recent use, recognized and remembered. The seasonal variation in vegetation, in water levels, in accessibility, all tracked mentally, all available as information when planning routes or interpreting current conditions. These mental maps achieve accuracy that seems remarkable when measured, but is simply the natural result of long practice and constant reinforcement. Someone who has walked the same trail hundreds of times in all seasons and conditions knows that trail not just approximately but precisely, knows that the oak tree is exactly this many steps from the shelter entrance, that the stream crossing is exactly this far beyond the oak, that the large flat stone suitable for sitting is precisely positioned relative to both. These distances are not measured in feet or meters. They're known in steps, in time, in effort. How many footfalls between landmarks? How long the walk takes when moving unhurried, how much energy is required, how tired one feels upon arrival, how much water should be carried to maintain comfort for a round trip. This embodied measurement is actually more useful than abstract numerical distances for practical navigation. Knowing that the stream is 947 meters from the shelter means little without also knowing terrain, elevation change, difficulty of the route. But knowing through direct experience that the walk takes approximately the time needed to descend while paying normal attention, while moving at comfortable pace, while pausing to note interesting features but not being distracted into long detours, provides immediately applicable information that guides decision-making automatically. Accuracy of these mental maps can be verified when modern researchers study indigenous peoples who still maintain traditional land use patterns, who still navigate primarily through mental maps rather than modern navigation tools. Studies show spatial memory accurate within 10 to 15 feet across miles of territory, an error margin far better than most modern people achieve even with maps and GPS when trying to remember the precise location of landscape features they've seen but not specifically studied. And this accuracy persists in darkness because the mental map is not primarily visual, it's multisensory. It encodes tactile information, acoustic information, olfactory information, thermal information, all integrated with visual information to create a representation that remains functional when any single sense provides reduced information. Close the eyes in familiar territory and the mental map still functions. Remove vision from the equation and hearing, touch, smell, temperature, proprioception, memory, all continue providing the information necessary for navigation. This is why darkness does not eliminate navigational ability. It reduces one channel of information but leaves others intact, and those others, when well developed through practice, when given attention, when trusted, prove sufficient for confident movement. The walk back from the stream carries water, changes the task slightly, but not the navigation. Weight distributed between hands, carrying containers made from hide or bark or stomach, vessels that hold enough for the night and morning without being so heavy as to make the return climb difficult. The path is known completely now, having been traversed downward moments ago, and the return simply reverses the sequence, touching the same landmarks in opposite order, feeling the trail change from the gritty stone-mixed section to the compressed earth above it, passing the oak tree that stands as the middle marker, continuing up the steeper section toward the shelter, the fire glow visible from some distance away now, the coals still breathing red light through the entrance, a visual beacon that the dark adapted eyes see clearly from farther away than might seem possible, that guides the final approach, that marks home with warm, welcoming certainty. The journey was unremarkable. The navigation was successful. The darkness was no obstacle. This is simply competence, simply the result of abilities that humans possess, that modern humans still possess but rarely develop, that respond to necessity and practice with reliable, functional capability. Wind reading, that constant reference to direction through the pressure and temperature of moving air against skin, functions continuously throughout the walk, confirming direction on descent and ascent, providing reassurance that each turn of the trail maintains expected orientation, that progress toward and away from water follows predicted patterns. The western wind remains steady, gentle, cool but not cold, carrying the mixed scents of the valley, of water and vegetation, and the distant presence of animals, of the complex smellscape that is always present but becomes more noticeable in darkness when vision does not dominate awareness. This wind has prevailed throughout the walk, consistent in direction and strength, and this consistency itself provides information, confirms that weather is stable, that no storms are approaching, that tomorrow will likely be similar to today unless patterns change overnight. Changes in wind matter. Sudden calm might indicate coming storms. Shift from west to south might bring warmer weather. Shift from west to north might bring cold. These changes are noted automatically, incorporated into the mental weather prediction that people maintain continuously, that guides decisions about whether to travel far from shelter, whether to expect rain or snow, whether tomorrow is likely to be good for hunting or better spent on other tasks. Temperature sensing, that thermal awareness that mapped the descent toward cool air pooled in the valley bottom, now maps the ascent in reverse, the air warming slightly as elevation increases, as distance from water increases, confirming return progress just as cooling confirmed descent progress. This is not conscious monitoring of thermometer readings. No one is thinking, The temperature has increased by 2 degrees Celsius, indicating that elevation has changed by approximately 50 meters. The sensation is simply noticed. Air feels slightly warmer on face and hands. This is recognized as expected, as confirming that the climb is proceeding correctly, that home is approaching, that the thermal gradient follows the familiar pattern it always follows on calm nights when air settles into its natural stratification, cold pooling low and warmth rising high, creating the vertical temperature structure that makes valleys cooler than hilltops, that makes elevated sleeping sites warmer and more comfortable than valley floors, that contributes to site selection decisions, to choosing where to build shelters, where to spend nights, where to locate long-term camps. These thermal patterns are part of landscape literacy, part of the knowledge that accumulates through years of living outdoors, sleeping under varying conditions, noticing correlations between position and comfort, between terrain and temperature, between weather patterns and thermal behavior. Feet climbing now rather than descending, working against gravity, feeling the increased effort in legs and lungs, but still reading the trail continuously, still detecting every texture change, every temperature variation, still providing tactile feedback that confirms progress, prevents straying from the path, maintains navigation accuracy. The trail here is particularly familiar because it's traveled multiple times daily, every trip to the stream requiring this same path down and back, every need for water initiating this same journey, building repetition that makes these particular steps automatic, that allows attention to wander to other thoughts while feet find the way without conscious guidance, the way modern people navigate stairs in their own homes without watching their feet, without consciously thinking about where to step. The movement pattern so ingrained through repetition that consciousness is not required, that happens automatically as long as nothing unusual disrupts the expected pattern. And this automaticity is not mindlessness, it's efficiency. It's the nervous system learning patterns, encoding them, executing them without requiring conscious attention, freeing that attention for other purposes, for observing animals, for noticing weather changes, for thinking about tomorrow's plans, for the mental work that humans do continuously, that happens in parallel with physical movement, that doesn't need to be interrupted by constant attention to foot placement unless conditions change enough to require it. Echo patterns return as the shelter is approached, the rock face that forms the back wall of the shelter reflecting sound more strongly than the open hillside below, creating acoustic signatures that announce arrival before visual recognition occurs, before even dark adapted eyes have distinguished the shelter's shape from the surrounding landscape. Call out, and the voice returns slightly, not a strong echo, but a subtle reinforcement that indicates proximity to reflecting surfaces. That means solid stone is nearby rather than open space. That means home is close. This echo recognition is not conscious analysis. It's simply awareness. The acoustic environment near the shelter sounds and feels different from the acoustic environment of the open hillside. Air moves differently. Sound behaves differently. Space feels enclosed rather than open. These differences register automatically, inform the sense of position, confirm that navigation has been successful, that the intended destination has been reached. The shelter entrance appears, recognizable by the faint glow of coals, by the familiar configuration of stone, by the particular quality of sheltered space compared to open hillside, by all the accumulated sensory cues that mark this specific location as distinct from every other location in the territory. This is home, or at least the current home, the place where people sleep tonight, where fire provides warmth and cooking, where tools and possessions are kept, where social life centers, where children play and adults work and everyone returns after the day's activities. Arrival is not dramatic. No announcement is needed, just careful movement through the entrance, just quiet steps between sleeping bodies, just setting down the water containers where they'll be accessible in the morning, just returning to the sleeping position, just settling back into furs and warmth and the slow drift toward sleep. The journey was successful. The navigation worked. The darkness presented no significant obstacle. This is simply normal. Simply what happens when capabilities are maintained, when skills are practiced, when trust in natural human sensory abilities is justified through consistent, successful performance. But this one walk represents only a tiny fragment of the total navigational experience that builds and maintains these capabilities. This walk was easy. Familiar territory, short distance, calm weather, no particular urgency. Navigation under these conditions, while not trivial, does not stress the system, does not require maximum performance, does not push capabilities to their limits. Other navigations are harder, longer journeys to more distant locations, travel during storms when wind and rain obscure sensory information, night hunting that requires stalking animals through unfamiliar terrain, following tracks and signs in darkness, interpreting evidence that is difficult to see even in daylight. Emergency travel when injury or illness requires moving to meet other groups, to seek help, to transport someone who cannot walk far. These more demanding navigations rely on the same fundamental capabilities, but require their fullest development, their most refined application, the kind of performance that comes only from lifelong practice, from continuous reinforcement, from culture that values and transmits these skills across generations, from children to parents to grandparents, extending back through time to the beginning of human presence in this landscape, whenever that was. However long ago people first came here and learned this territory and began building the accumulated knowledge that each generation inherits and augments. Training begins early, not formal instruction, not classroom lessons, just accompaniment. Children walk with adults from the time they can walk, initially carried when tired but encouraged to manage short distances themselves, to observe, to participate, to begin building their own sensory awareness and mental maps. By age 5 or 6, children are walking substantial distances, following behind adults on gathering trips, on hunting expeditions, on visits to neighboring groups. By 10 or 12, they're beginning to navigate independently over short, familiar routes, to prove competence, to demonstrate that they've learned the territory adequately. By late adolescence, by the age when modern teenagers are learning to drive cars, these young people are competent navigators across the entire home territory, capable of moving alone or in small groups to any known location, in daylight or darkness, in good weather or marginal conditions, with confidence built from years of practice, from hundreds or thousands of successful navigations, from continuous sensory engagement with the landscape that has made every significant feature familiar, that has encoded the territory into neural maps as detailed and accurate as any modern cartography. And this learning is not painful. It's not experienced as difficult or burdensome. It's simply life. Simply what everyone does. Children want to be competent, want to participate, want to learn what adults know. The motivation is intrinsic. The practice is embedded in daily activities. The feedback is immediate and natural. Navigate successfully and arrive where you intended. Navigate poorly and get lost. Experience discomfort. Learn from mistakes. No grades are given. No certificates awarded. Competence simply develops through practice and necessity, through the requirements of living in a landscape where navigation matters, where knowing the way means access to resources and safety and connection to others, where incompetence means hardship and danger and isolation. Darkness is not treated as special, not feared, not avoided, simply another condition that affects how tasks are accomplished but does not prevent their accomplishment. If something needs doing at night, it gets done. If water is needed, someone walks to the stream regardless of whether the moon is up or the stars are visible or the night is black and overcast. If someone is sick or injured, help is sought even if that requires moving through darkness. If animals are heard approaching the camp at night, adults rise to investigate, to protect, to drive off potential threats without waiting for daylight to reveal what the threat might be. This attitude toward darkness, this pragmatic acceptance rather than fearful avoidance, means that nighttime navigation is practiced regularly, continuously, throughout life, maintaining the very skills that make such navigation possible. Modern people, by contrast, avoid darkness whenever possible, arrange lives to minimize nighttime activity outside of artificially lit environments, actively choose to remain in light rather than venture into darkness, and therefore never practice the skills that would make darkness navigable, never develop the capabilities that remain dormant in their nervous systems, never learn that darkness is not actually an impenetrable barrier, but simply a different condition requiring different sensory emphasis and slightly more caution, but remaining fundamentally navigable with appropriate skills. The integration of multiple senses proves crucial to understanding how navigation in darkness becomes possible and reliable. No single sense dominates. No single source of information provides complete guidance. Instead, vision and hearing and smell and touch and temperature and proprioception and memory all contribute, creating redundancy, providing multiple channels that confirm and reinforce each other, catching errors or ambiguities in one channel through clarity in others. This is how certainty emerges from conditions that would seem too uncertain for confident navigation. Vision in darkness provides some information, but not complete information. Alone, it might be insufficient, but vision plus hearing, plus smell, plus touch, plus memory creates sufficiency. The stream is heard before it's seen. The approach is felt through cooling air before it's heard. The path is felt underfoot continuously. The direction is confirmed by wind. The position is confirmed by touching familiar landmarks. Each sense adds its contribution. Each contribution is small, but the sum becomes adequate, becomes sufficient, becomes the basis for confident movement through conditions that would stop someone relying on vision alone, that would seem impossible to someone whose other senses have atrophied from disuse, that become navigable only through the integration that practice creates, that culture encourages, that necessity demands. This integration happens automatically, without conscious orchestration, the brain processing multiple sensory streams simultaneously and continuously, extracting from each whatever information it provides, weighting more heavily the senses that are currently most reliable, allowing seamless transition when conditions change and one sense becomes more or less useful. Walking through open grassland, vision might contribute more because long sight lines allow dark adapted eyes to see farther. Entering forest, hearing and touch might become more important as vegetation blocks vision. Approaching water, smell provides earlier detection than vision or hearing might in some conditions. Crossing familiar ground, memory and proprioception might dominate, the body knowing the way so completely that conscious sensory monitoring decreases, attention freed for other purposes while navigation continues automatically. This flexible integration, this dynamic weighting of sensory inputs based on current conditions and reliability, represents sophisticated neural processing that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand, that AI researchers try to replicate in sensor fusion systems for autonomous vehicles, that remains far more elegant and effective in biological systems than in artificial ones, despite decades of engineering effort. Practice matters immensely. The infant who has never walked cannot navigate in any conditions. The child learning to walk in daylight initially stumbles even with clear vision. The adult who has walked thousands of miles in all conditions navigates more efficiently, more confidently, with less conscious effort than someone with less experience. And within this general progression of increasing capability, specific practice in darkness creates specific improvements in dark navigation. Walk in darkness regularly, and dark adaptation happens faster. Vision in low light improves. Attention to non-visual cues sharpens. Integration of multiple senses becomes more automatic. Avoid darkness. Remain in artificially lit environments. Never practice navigating without abundant light. And the capabilities atrophy, remaining present in potential but undeveloped in practice, unavailable for reliable use when needed. This is not mysterious. This is how learning works, how skill development works, how the nervous system responds to regular demands versus irregular demands versus absence of demands. The pianist who practices daily plays better than the pianist who practices occasionally. The runner who trains regularly runs faster than the runner who runs only occasionally. The navigator who navigates regularly in darkness navigates better in darkness than someone who avoids darkness and practices only lit navigation. The principle is universal. The application to dark navigation is simply one more instance of the general truth that capabilities develop through use and atrophy through disuse. Modern life has eliminated almost all necessity for dark navigation, and with that elimination has come the loss of these capabilities across entire populations in just a generation or two. Artificial light is ubiquitous in industrialized societies. Street lights illuminate roads and sidewalks. Indoor lighting banishes darkness from homes and workplaces. Flashlights and headlamps accompany people on the rare occasions when they venture into natural darkness. GPS navigation removes the need for mental mapping even in daylight. The entire technological envelope of modern life has been engineered to eliminate darkness and eliminate the need for the kind of navigation that darkness requires. And this engineering has been wildly successful at its intended purpose, making nighttime activity safer and more convenient, reducing the accidents and difficulties that darkness once created, enabling 24-hour economic activity and social life that would be impossible without artificial light. But this success has costs. Capabilities lost, skills forgotten, sensory systems underdeveloped, confidence eroded. Modern people, removed from artificial light, placed in natural darkness, frequently experience anxiety and disorientation that people in traditional societies never experience because they've never developed the capabilities that make darkness navigable, because they've never practiced the skills that transform darkness from impenetrable barrier to merely darker condition, because culture no longer transmits this knowledge, no longer values these abilities, no longer creates the necessity that would drive their development. The loss happens quickly. One generation living traditionally, practicing dark navigation throughout life, maintaining full capability. The next generation exposed to artificial light, using it whenever available, practicing dark navigation less frequently, maintaining partial capability. The third generation raised entirely in artificially lit environments, never practicing dark navigation at all, losing capability almost completely. By this point, cultural knowledge has eroded. Parents can't teach children skills they themselves never learned. The very possibility of dark navigation becomes questionable. How could people navigate in complete darkness? They must have had better night vision than modern people. Evolution must have changed. We've lost something biological. But this interpretation is wrong. Nothing biological has changed. The eyes are structurally identical. the rods still exist. The neural processing capacity remains. What's changed is purely behavioral, purely cultural, purely the result of environmental conditions that eliminate practice, that make skills unnecessary, that allow capabilities to lie dormant generation after generation. And because the capabilities remain present in potential, they can be redeveloped. Not easily, not without significant effort and practice, but the nervous system remains plastic. The senses remain trainable. An adult who commits to spending time in darkness, who practices dark adaptation, who pays attention to non-visual senses, who builds mental maps through repeated navigation, can develop substantial capability within months, can achieve functional proficiency within a year or two, demonstrating that these abilities are not mysterious, not superhuman, not lost to evolution, but simply dormant, waiting, capable of reactivation if circumstances make them useful enough to justify the practice they require. Recovery of these skills in individuals or populations follows predictable patterns. Initial exposure to darkness is disorienting, uncomfortable, anxiety-producing. Vision seems useless. Other senses seem uninformative. Movement seems dangerous. This is the modern starting point, the baseline from which improvement begins. But with practice, with repeated exposure, with commitment to staying in darkness rather than immediately returning to light, changes begin to happen. Dark adaptation becomes more complete. Eyes begin to see what seemed invisible. After 10 minutes in darkness, basic shapes emerge. After 30 minutes, movement through familiar indoor spaces becomes possible. After an hour, the dark-adapted eye begins to approach its full potential, seeing by available light that seemed non-existent, detecting movement at surprising distances, finding functional vision where blindness seemed absolute. Continue practicing. Spend hours in darkness regularly. Walk familiar outdoor routes at night without flashlight. Force non-visual senses to contribute. Pay attention to sounds, to temperature, to wind, to the feel of ground underfoot. And hearing sharpens. Not physically. The ear doesn't change, but attention changes. Processing changes. Sounds become more informative. Direction becomes easier to determine. Distance becomes easier to estimate. Touch becomes more informative. Temperature differences become more noticeable. Mental maps begin to develop, encoding the spatial relationships between landmarks, building the internal representation that makes navigation possible even when sensory information is sparse. After months of this practice, after regular nighttime walks, after continuous sensory engagement with natural darkness, capability improves dramatically. What seemed impossible becomes possible. What seemed dangerous becomes routine. Confidence replaces anxiety. Darkness transforms from enemy to neutral condition, requiring adjustment and caution but not preventing activity, not eliminating competence. The question of why ancient people never got lost in darkness has no single answer, no simple explanation, because the question itself is based on misunderstanding. They did occasionally get disoriented. They did sometimes choose to wait for light rather than travel in darkness when conditions were particularly difficult or unfamiliar terrain made navigation uncertain. They were not superhuman. They did not possess magical abilities. What they possessed was simply competence, developed through necessity and practice, capabilities that all humans possess in potential, but that modern humans rarely develop because modern life eliminates the necessity that would drive development. They navigated successfully in darkness through dark adapted vision that took 30 to 45 minutes to develop fully, but then allowed seeing by starlight alone. Through hearing that detected sounds 3 to 4 times farther than modern ears typically manage, not through better physical structures, but through better attention and processing, through smell that located water from a quarter-mile away when wind conditions were favorable, that identified specific locations by their distinctive scents, that tracked animals and detected danger through olfactory information that modern people ignore or never learn to interpret, through bare feet that read the ground continuously, detecting texture and temperature changes that marked trails and confirmed position, providing tactile information that shoes eliminate and modern people never develop, through mental maps built over lifetimes of travel across familiar territory, encoding spatial relationships and landmark positions with precision within 10 to 15 feet across miles of terrain, creating internal representations as detailed and useful as any paper map or GPS coordinate system, through wind reading that provided constant directional reference, through temperature sensing that mapped terrain through thermal gradients, through acoustic awareness that used echoes to reveal space and structure, through integration of all these senses into seamless multisensory awareness that made darkness navigable, not through excellence in any single sense, but through adequacy across many senses working together, creating redundancy and confirmation that eliminated the uncertainty that any single sense might produce. And they navigated successfully because practice had made these capabilities automatic, reliable, unconscious, the way modern people drive cars while talking or listening to music, the basic operations of steering and speed control relegated to automatic processes that don't require conscious attention, freeing consciousness for other activities. Walk familiar ground in darkness 1,000 times, and the walk becomes automatic. Feet find the way. Senses process information without requiring conscious interpretation. The brain navigates while consciousness attends to other things, to social thoughts, to planning, to memory, to whatever occupies the mind during routine activities. This automaticity is not mindlessness, it's efficiency. It's the nervous system learning patterns thoroughly enough that they execute reliably without supervision, creating the confidence that allows movement through darkness without fear, without constant worry, without the anxiety that would arise if every step required conscious attention and deliberate decision-making. They navigated successfully because culture supported and transmitted these skills. Children learned by observation and participation. Adults modeled competence. The value of these capabilities was obvious and immediate. No one questioned whether dark navigation was possible because everyone saw it happening continuously. No one worried that darkness might have become unnavigable because every generation successfully navigated it. The skills were not written down, not formally taught, not made into curriculum, but simply transmitted through the normal process of children accompanying adults, watching, imitating, practicing, receiving feedback, gradually developing their own capabilities until they became the competent adults who would transmit skills to the next generation. This is how culture works in traditional societies, how skills persist across generations without writing or formal education, how knowledge accumulates and refines and transmits through direct experience and observation and practice rather than through abstract symbolic representation. And they navigated successfully because necessity demanded it. Resources were distributed across landscape. Water was here, game was there, good stone for tools was elsewhere. Productive plant gathering sites were scattered across territory. Other groups lived at specific locations requiring travel to visit. This distribution could not be compressed into artificially lit spaces, could not be postponed until daylight if darkness happened to be present. Life required movement. Sometimes that movement happened in darkness, and because it was necessary, it was practiced. Because it was practiced, it became competent. Because it became competent, It remained part of cultural knowledge, transmitted reliably, maintained through use. Modern life has eliminated this necessity for most people in industrialized societies. Resources come through supply chains that operate invisibly. Food arrives at stores without requiring personal travel to gathering sites. Water flows from taps without requiring trips to streams. Social connection happens through electronic communication without requiring physical travel to visit others. The entire structure of modern life has been engineered to make individual competence in navigation less necessary, to make darkness avoidable, to make reliance on artificial systems the norm and personal capability the exception. This is comfortable, convenient, efficient in many ways, but it carries the cost of lost capabilities, lost confidence, lost connection to the natural sensory and cognitive abilities that human nervous systems contain, that evolved over millions of years, that served our ancestors well, but now lie mostly dormant, unused, barely remembered in populations that have lived for generations in artificially lit environments where darkness has been banished and the skills it requires have become unnecessary. The capabilities remain. The potential persists. Any human with functional senses can develop substantial dark navigation ability with practice and commitment. The eyes retain their rods and their capacity for scotopic vision. The ears retain their processing capability. The nose retains its sensitivity. The skin retains its thermoreceptors and pressure sensors. The brain retains its capacity for spatial memory and sensory integration. Nothing has been lost biologically. What's been lost is practice, necessity, cultural transmission. And what's been lost can be partially recovered through dedication, through spending time in darkness, through paying attention to senses beyond vision, through building mental maps and trusting those maps, through allowing dark adaptation to complete, through the hard work of developing capabilities that modern life makes unnecessary, but that remain possible, that remain part of human potential, that can be awakened through effort even after generations of dormancy. The path back to competence in darkness exists for those who choose to walk it, but the path requires leaving behind the comfortable convenience of artificial light, requires experiencing the discomfort of initial disorientation and incompetence, requires patience through the months of practice needed for substantial improvement, requires commitment to maintaining skills through regular practice once developed. Few modern people choose this path. Fewer still succeed in following it far enough to achieve real proficiency. But the possibility remains, demonstrating that the question of why ancient people navigated darkness successfully is really a question about practice and necessity and cultural transmission, rather than about lost biology or superhuman capabilities or mysterious abilities that modern people lack. The fire has dimmed to the faintest glow. The water containers rest near the entrance, ready for morning. Sleep returns easily, body relaxed from the walk, mind quiet from the familiar routine, confidence unshaken by the darkness that surrounds the shelter, that fills the valley, that covers the entire landscape from here to the horizon and beyond. Darkness is not enemy, not mystery, not obstacle, just absence of light, just different condition, just one more variation in the endless variations that life presents, that require adaptation, that demand capability, that reward competence with successful outcomes and punish incompetence with difficulty and danger. The skills exist. The senses function. The nervous system integrates information and guides movement. The mental maps record territory and enable navigation. The practice has been lifelong. The transmission has been cultural. The necessity has been constant. And the result is simple competence, unremarkable capability, the kind of basic functioning that every mature member of society achieves, that requires no special talent or gift, that simply develops through normal life in normal conditions, through the requirements that this environment imposes, through the abilities that human biology provides, through the endless feedback loop of action and result that shapes behavior and builds skill and creates the confident, competent navigation through darkness that seems mysterious to modern people, but was simply normal life, ordinary capability, expected competence for people who lived without artificial light, who accepted darkness as part of the daily cycle, who developed and maintained the full range of human sensory abilities rather than allowing most of them to atrophy through disuse in artificially lit environments where only vision matters and other senses contribute little to the navigation that electric lights make trivial and simple and utterly dependent on continued power supply, on continued technological functioning, on continued cultural choices that prioritize convenience over capability, comfort over competence, artificial assistance over natural ability. Outside, in the valley where the stream flows, where darkness remains complete except for the faint starlight that occasionally breaks through clouds, other movements happen, other navigations occur, the landscape never truly still, never truly empty, always hosting life in all its forms. Diurnal creatures settling into sleep while nocturnal animals emerge for their own activities, their own hunting and foraging and traveling, their own navigations through darkness that don't rely on human methods but achieve similar results through different adaptations, through enhanced night vision in the case of cats and owls, through echolocation in the case of bats, through scent trailing in the case of wolves and other canines, through the diverse array of solutions that evolution has produced for the common problem of moving successfully through environments where light is limited or absent. These animals don't think about their navigation, don't consciously develop skills, don't transmit techniques culturally. They simply inherit the adaptations that their species has accumulated over evolutionary time, express those adaptations automatically through genetically encoded behaviors and sensory structures, succeed or fail based on whether their inherited capabilities match the demands of their environment. Humans possess some innate navigation capability, some inborn spatial sense and sensory processing, but human navigation relies more heavily on learning, on cultural transmission, on skills that must be developed through practice rather than being available automatically from birth. This makes human adaptation slower, makes each generation's capabilities dependent on what the previous generation taught and what circumstances demanded, but it also makes human adaptation more flexible, more capable of adjusting to varying conditions and environments, more able to function across the enormous range of habitats that humans occupy, from Arctic to tropical, from desert to rainforest, from sea level to high mountains, from the diverse conditions that no single set of genetic adaptations could optimally serve, but that cultural transmission of locally appropriate skills can accommodate effectively. The difference between inherited and learned navigation capabilities becomes clear when comparing human performance across generations and cultures. The human eye structure is essentially identical worldwide. The ears are the same, the nose is the same. The basic sensory hardware is standard equipment, varying slightly between individuals, but showing no significant population-level differences that would explain performance differences. Yet, navigation capabilities vary dramatically. Traditional peoples who live without artificial light navigate darkness with confidence that modern urban populations lack entirely. But place an urban child in a traditional context, raise them with constant practice in dark navigation, with cultural transmission of relevant skills, with necessity driving development, and that child develops capabilities indistinguishable from children raised traditionally. Similarly, place a traditional child in modern urban context, raise them with artificial light and no practice in dark navigation, and they lose capabilities that their parents possessed. This demonstrates that the differences are not genetic, not biological in the sense of inherited structures, but learned, cultural, developed through experience rather than being encoded in DNA. The hardware is the same. The software differs based on what's installed, what's practiced, what environment demands and rewards. This plasticity of human capability, this dependence on learning rather than pure instinct, creates both vulnerability and opportunity. Vulnerability because skills can be lost, forgotten, allowed to atrophy across generations when circumstances don't demand their maintenance. Traditional navigation skills have been lost repeatedly in human history as populations adopt new technologies, as lifestyles change, as necessity disappears. The maritime navigation skills of Polynesian voyagers, which allowed them to sail thousands of miles across open ocean using star positions, wave patterns, bird behavior, and other natural cues without instruments, were nearly lost as Western navigation technology replaced traditional methods, as younger generations adopted GPS and charts rather than learning the intricate observational skills their ancestors had refined over centuries. Only deliberate cultural revival efforts have preserved and restored some of these traditional skills, demonstrating that they can be lost through disuse, but also recovered through dedicated practice. The same vulnerability applies to dark navigation skills. Introduce artificial light, remove necessity for dark navigation, allow a generation to pass without practice, and the skills vanish from the cultural repertoire, remaining only as historical curiosities, as things ancestors could do, but modern people cannot. But plasticity also creates opportunity. Lost skills can be recovered. Modern people can relearn dark navigation if motivated sufficiently. The nervous system remains capable. The senses remain trainable. The potential persists even after generations of dormancy. Recovery efforts, whether for traditional navigation, dark navigation, or other skills that modern life has made unnecessary, follow similar patterns. Initial romantic enthusiasm. This is amazing. Our ancestors could do this. We should learn it too. Then difficult reality. Skills that seem simple when watching experts prove frustratingly hard to learn. Dark adaptation is uncomfortable. Moving through darkness without light triggers anxiety. Progress is slow. Mistakes are frequent. Disorientation occurs regularly. This is where most people quit. The difficulty exceeds the motivation. The discomfort outweighs the benefits. Artificial alternatives are too convenient. Why practice dark navigation when flashlights are available? Why spend months developing skills when flipping a switch provides immediate illumination? The logic is compelling for individuals, but at population level, at cultural level, the cumulative effect of these individual choices is loss of capability, loss of resilience, loss of connection to the full range of human potential, creation of dependencies on technologies that might not always be available, that might fail when needed most, that make people vulnerable in ways that self-reliant capabilities would not. The few who persist past initial difficulty, who continue practicing despite frustration, who commit to developing skills even though alternatives exist, eventually experience transformation. The darkness that seemed impenetrable becomes navigable. The anxiety that accompanied early attempts fades. Confidence develops. Not overconfidence. Not the sense that darkness presents no challenges, but realistic confidence based on demonstrated capability, on successful navigations, on skills that work reliably when applied properly. This confidence is hard-won. It comes only through sustained practice, but once established, it proves remarkably durable. Skills maintained through regular use persist through life. Mental maps once built remain accessible for years even without continuous reinforcement. The nervous system seems to retain patterns of sensory integration to remember how to navigate in darkness even after breaks in practice. This durability suggests that the neural changes underlying skill development are substantial, deep, persistent, rather than superficial or temporary, which makes sense given the importance of navigation to survival, given the value of retaining hard-won capabilities rather than having to relearn them after every interruption in practice. Teaching others accelerates personal skill development. Trying to explain to someone else how to navigate in darkness, what to pay attention to, what cues matter, what techniques work, forces explicit awareness of knowledge that has become automatic, that operates below conscious attention, that functions through intuition and feel rather than through deliberate step-by-step thinking. This explicit awareness, this translation of embodied knowledge into communicable instruction, deepens understanding, reveals gaps in personal technique, highlights aspects that need refinement. Good teachers become better practitioners through teaching. Cultural transmission creates this teaching necessity, this requirement to make implicit knowledge explicit enough to transmit across generations, and in doing so reinforces and improves the skills being transmitted, creating upward spirals of increasing capability rather than decay through imperfect transmission. Traditional societies with strong cultural transmission mechanisms for navigation skills often show remarkably sophisticated techniques that exceed what individual invention would likely produce, suggesting that the accumulated refinements of many generations, each contributing small improvements, create collective knowledge that surpasses individual capability, that represents cultural capital as valuable as any material technology, as useful as any physical tool. The integration of dark navigation with other survival skills creates synergies that make each component more valuable. Someone who navigates confidently in darkness can hunt more effectively because many prey animals are active at night, because approaching animals in darkness reduces detection, because darkness provides cover that daylight eliminates. Gathering also benefits. Some plants are easier to process at night when temperatures are cooler. Water collection happens without the heat stress of midday sun. Travel between locations can occur in darkness when necessary, allowing flexible scheduling, allowing movement when daylight hours are consumed by other activities. Emergency responses improve. If someone is injured at night, help can be sought immediately rather than waiting for dawn. If weather threatens, moving to better shelter can happen in darkness rather than enduring dangerous conditions until light permits travel. The confidence to move in darkness eliminates the restriction that darkness would otherwise impose, approximately doubling the usable hours in each day, making people less vulnerable to circumstances that occur at night, more resilient to the full range of conditions that life presents. Modern military forces recognize the tactical advantage that darkness provides, invest heavily in night vision technology, train extensively in nighttime operations, attempt to replicate through technology, and practice the capabilities that traditional people developed through cultural transmission and lifelong experience. The military investment demonstrates the value of night capability even in modern contexts, even with access to sophisticated technology. But military night operations remain different from traditional dark navigation. Modern soldiers carry night vision goggles that amplify available light or display thermal imagery, artificial aids that work excellently when functioning, but create absolute dependence, create vulnerability to equipment failure, battery depletion, damage, technical problems. Traditional navigation creates independence, resilience, capability that persists regardless of whether any external equipment functions, that requires nothing beyond the body's own senses and the skills developed through practice. Neither approach is superior in all contexts. Technology provides advantages in many situations, but pure skill provides advantages too, particularly in sustainability, independence, resilience to equipment failure. The optimal approach likely combines both, maintaining technological aids while also developing fundamental capabilities that function when technology fails, creating layered competence rather than brittle dependence on single approaches. The progression from incompetence to competence in dark navigation follows a learning curve that's steep, initially, then levels to more gradual improvement. First few exposures to darkness show minimal capability. Eyes barely adapt. Other senses seem uninformative. Disorientation is frequent. Progress is measured in small victories. Successfully navigating across a familiar room without light. Walking down a known hallway without collision. These seem trivial to people with access to light, but represent genuine capability development for someone starting from complete dependence on artificial illumination. After weeks of practice, capability improves noticeably. Dark adaptation happens faster. Eyes see more in low light. Hearing becomes more informative. Simple outdoor navigation becomes possible in familiar areas. Walking from house to car in darkness without needing flashlight. Following familiar trail at night without constantly checking for obstacles. These capabilities, still limited to known territory and good conditions, nonetheless represent substantial progress from initial incompetence. After months of sustained practice, capability reaches levels that allow reliable navigation across familiar territory in most conditions. Mental maps develop. Sensory integration improves. Confidence increases. Movement through darkness becomes routine rather than adventurous. Normal rather than special. Just another way to navigate rather than frightening challenge, requiring extra courage. This is perhaps the threshold where modern practitioners reach something approximating traditional competence in familiar territory, though still lacking the extended repertoire of skills and the deep territorial knowledge that lifelong traditional practice creates. Further improvement beyond this threshold comes more slowly. Developing capability in unfamiliar territory requires travel to new areas, repeated navigation building new mental maps, extending the range of confident navigation beyond the home territory that initial practice focused on. Improving performance in difficult conditions requires practicing in worse weather, in heavier cloud cover, in terrain that's more challenging, pushing capabilities rather than always practicing under optimal circumstances. Refining specific techniques requires focused attention to particular skills, practicing echo generation and interpretation, developing better temperature sensitivity, learning to read wind patterns more accurately. Each refinement adds capability incrementally, the improvements getting smaller as competence increases, but still valuable, still worth pursuing for people committed to excellence rather than mere adequacy. Traditional practitioners, practicing from childhood through entire lives, achieve levels of capability that modern learners starting in adulthood rarely match, demonstrating both that skills improve continuously with practice and that early learning creates advantages that late learners struggle to overcome. But even adult learners can achieve functional competence, can reach levels adequate for most practical purposes, can gain the confidence and capability that transforms darkness from barrier to mere condition requiring adjustment. This is the realistic goal for modern people interested in developing these skills, not to match the very best traditional navigators, not to achieve extraordinary capabilities, but to develop solid functional competence that makes darkness navigable, that reduces dependence on artificial light, that creates resilience and confidence and connection to natural human capabilities that modern life has allowed to atrophy. The question of whether darkness navigation skills are worth developing in modern contexts admits no universal answer. For people living entirely in urban environments with reliable electricity, with lit streets and buildings, with minimal time spent in natural settings, the practical utility might be minimal. The effort required to develop skills exceeds the benefit they provide. But for people who spend time outdoors, who camp or hike, who might face situations where artificial light fails or isn't available, the utility increases. For people interested in self-reliance, in resilience, in reducing dependence on technology that might not always be available, the skills have value beyond immediate utility. For people curious about human capabilities, about what our species can do when allowed to develop our full potential, the exploration itself provides reward independent of practical applications. And for everyone, there's value in understanding that the darkness that seems impenetrable is actually navigable, that the limitations modern people experience in darkness are learned limitations rather than absolute biological constraints, that humans possess sensory capabilities far exceeding what modern life allows us to develop, that cultural transmission and practice create competencies that genetics alone cannot provide. This understanding might not motivate skill development, but changes perspective, reveals something about human nature, about the relationship between biology and culture, about the plasticity of capability and the importance of practice, and the ways that environment and necessity shape what humans can do, what seems possible, what gets transmitted across generations, and what gets lost when circumstances change. Darkness is not what it seems to modern people who experience it only briefly, who flood it with artificial light at every opportunity, who never allow their eyes to adapt fully, who never develop the non-visual senses that provide information when vision fails. Darkness is not absence, not emptiness, not the complete void that it appears to be during the first seconds after lights go out. Darkness is simply reduced illumination, conditions where different sensory strategies become necessary, environment that demands different skills but remains navigable to those who possess those skills, who have practiced the techniques, who trust their non-visual senses to provide guidance when eyes provide insufficient information. The darkness outside this shelter, beyond the fading coals of the dying fire, seems absolute to modern sensibilities, seems impenetrable and dangerous, seems like it should prevent movement, should confine people to their shelters until daylight returns. But it prevents nothing. It confines no one. People move through it successfully, navigate confidently, accomplish necessary tasks, return safely. The darkness is just darkness, just part of the daily cycle, just one more condition among the countless conditions that life presents, that humans must navigate, that require appropriate skills and strategies, that yield to competence and confound incompetence, that reward practice and punish neglect. And the competence exists, the skills function, the navigation succeeds, not through magic, not through superhuman abilities, just through normal human capabilities developed to their potential, through necessity and practice and cultural transmission, and the countless small learnings that accumulate over lifetimes into solid, reliable, usable skill that makes darkness navigable, that makes night as accessible as day, that makes the full 24-hour cycle available for living rather than restricting activity to the portion that happens to be illuminated by the sun. Sleep comes deeply now, body relaxed, mind quiet, the security of shelter and the warmth of the shared sleeping space, combining with the satisfied fatigue of a day lived fully, of work done and food eaten and social bonds maintained, of the continuous rhythm of life that flows through days and nights without the artificial separation that modern schedules impose, without the sense that daytime is for activity and nighttime is for sleep, and the two should not mix, without the restriction that darkness imposes only when people lack the skills to navigate it, when culture fails to transmit the capabilities that make it manageable, when technology creates dependence that eliminates the necessity that would drive skill development. Here there is no such separation, no such restriction, no such dependence, just the continuous flow of life responding to needs and opportunities and conditions as they arise, using darkness when darkness is present, using light when light is present, adapting continuously to the endless variation that natural environments present, that cannot be controlled or standardized or made uniform, that demand flexibility and capability and the kind of competence that develops only through sustained engagement with natural conditions rather than insulation from them. This is not primitive life, not inferior to modern existence, just different, optimized for different circumstances, adapted to different constraints, creating different capabilities and accepting different limitations. Neither approach is universally superior. Each has advantages and disadvantages. Each makes sense in its own context. But the modern approach has become so dominant, so universal in industrialized societies, that alternatives are forgotten, that different ways of living become invisible, that capabilities like dark navigation become incomprehensible mysteries, rather than simply skills that some people maintain and others don't, depending on what their circumstances demand and what their culture transmits and what necessity requires. The breathing of sleeping people creates subtle sounds that blend with the faint crackle of coals, with the whisper of wind outside the shelter entrance, with the distant sounds of the stream and the night animals and the living landscape that never falls completely silent, that maintains its own rhythms independent of human activity, that provides the acoustic backdrop against which human life plays out. This soundscape is familiar, known, as recognizable as the visual appearance of the shelter would be in daylight. Each sound has meaning. Each variation carries information. The change in breathing patterns when someone shifts position in sleep, the particular crackle that coals make when they're nearly extinguished versus the sound they make when still maintaining substantial heat, the wind that suggests continued calm weather versus the wind that might presage tomorrow's storm. None of this requires conscious attention. The sleeping mind monitors sound even in sleep, maintains awareness at some level, responds to unusual sounds with waking alertness while allowing normal sounds to continue without disturbance. This is how humans sleep in environments where vigilance matters, where threats might manifest during sleep, where the difference between appropriate sounds and concerning sounds might be important for survival. Modern people sleeping in secure buildings with locked doors often lose this acoustic awareness in sleep, dropping into deeper unconsciousness that's less vigilant, less responsive, secure in the knowledge that walls and locks provide protection, that dangerous intrusions are unlikely, that sleep can be complete withdrawal rather than vigilant rest. Neither pattern is better. Each makes sense in its context. But the traditional pattern, the lighter sleep that maintains awareness, that responds to acoustic cues even while unconscious, that never fully disconnects from environmental monitoring, may preserve capabilities that modern deep sleep does not, may maintain neural connections and processing patterns that total unconsciousness allows to weaken, may represent another small difference in how different lifestyles create different capabilities, different strengths and weaknesses, different adaptations to different circumstances. The night progresses toward dawn. Though dawn is still hours away, still beyond the horizon, both literal and temporal, still waiting in the future that will eventually arrive but hasn't yet, that exists as certainty, but not as present reality. The darkness outside remains complete. The stars have vanished behind thickening clouds. No moonlight will arrive tonight. The moon is in the wrong phase, too close to new, setting too soon after sunset to provide illumination in these middle hours of darkness. This is one of the darkest nights, one of the times when human vision provides minimal assistance, when other senses must carry more weight, when navigation demands fuller integration of all available information sources. But this darkness presents no special challenge to people who practice navigation regularly in all conditions. It simply requires using techniques that always work rather than relying on vision more than usual. The same techniques that function in complete darkness function equally well in partial darkness, in twilight, in moonlight, in any condition where vision provides less than complete information. The skills don't compartmentalize into darkness navigation and daylight navigation as distinct categories. They exist on a continuum, with different senses contributing more or less depending on conditions, with the integration adapting automatically to whatever information is available, emphasizing whatever works best in current circumstances while de-emphasizing whatever is less reliable. This flexibility, this adaptive weighting of sensory inputs, proves crucial to understanding how navigation remains functional across the enormous range of conditions that natural environments present, from bright sunlight to complete darkness, from clear weather to storm conditions, from familiar territory to unfamiliar terrain, from easy situations to challenging ones. The human nervous system evolved to function across this range, to adapt to varying conditions, rather than requiring uniform circumstances, to extract whatever information is available and integrate it into coherent awareness that guides action successfully. Memory plays enormous roles in navigation that often go unrecognized, because memory functions so automatically, so below conscious awareness, that its contributions become invisible until they fail. The stream visited tonight has been visited thousands of times. Each visit reinforced memory of its location, its characteristics, its relationship to other landmarks. Each visit practiced the route, strengthened the neural patterns that encode the path from shelter to stream, made the navigation more automatic and reliable. Without this accumulated memory, without the mental map built through repeated experience, dark navigation would be far more difficult, perhaps impossible in complete darkness. New territory, unfamiliar terrain, locations visited only once or twice do not benefit from this memory reinforcement, do not have the same deep encoding in neural patterns, require more conscious attention, more careful sensory monitoring, more tentative movement, until familiarity develops. This is why territorial knowledge matters so much, why people historically maintained strong attachments to home territories, why displacement from familiar landscapes created substantial hardship beyond just the loss of resources and social connections. The mental maps, the accumulated knowledge of specific places, the practiced routes and known landmarks all represent irreplaceable capital, value that cannot be quickly recreated in new locations, that requires years of experience to develop fully. Modern mobility, the ease with which people relocate across continents, carrying possessions but not carrying the deep territorial knowledge that takes lifetimes to develop, creates a different relationship with place, one based more on universal skills that function anywhere and less on specific knowledge of particular locations. This mobility has advantages. People can pursue opportunities anywhere. Populations can redistribute in response to changing economic conditions, but it also creates losses. The deep knowledge of place that traditional territorial attachment created, the refined awareness of specific landscapes, the intimate familiarity that makes navigation automatic and enables sophisticated use of local resources. Modern people often lack this depth of connection to any specific place, live more superficially across many places rather than deeply in one place, creating different strengths and weaknesses, different capabilities and limitations. The specific knowledge that deep territorial familiarity creates includes not just static features, but dynamic patterns, seasonal changes, weather effects, animal behaviors, all the temporal variations that make landscapes living systems rather than static maps. The stream visited tonight flows differently in different seasons. Spring brings snowmelt, higher water, faster current, different crossing points than summer when flow decreases and water runs slower and shallower. Fall brings fallen leaves that accumulate in quiet pools, changing the water's appearance and sometimes its accessibility. Winter might bring ice, complete freezing of small tributaries, different sounds as water flows under ice shelves rather than openly through the air. These seasonal variations are all part of the mental map, all encoded in memory, all available as information when planning routes or interpreting current conditions. Someone who has experienced all these variations knows what to expect, knows what's normal versus unusual for this season, can detect changes that might signal important shifts in conditions. This temporal knowledge layers on top of spatial knowledge, creating four-dimensional understanding of territory that includes not just where things are, but how they change, what patterns they follow, what variations are normal and what are anomalous. Modern people, spending less time in specific places, experiencing landscapes less continuously, often lack this temporal depth, know places only in their current state, miss the patterns that only emerge through years of observation, cannot distinguish normal from unusual because they haven't established baselines through extended experience. Animal behaviors provide another layer of territorial knowledge that integrates with navigation skills. The deer that bed in the thicket half a mile west of the shelter, the bison that prefer the open grassland to the south, the wolves that den in the rocky outcrop 3 miles north. These animals follow predictable patterns, occupy specific locations, create trails through repeated use, modify vegetation through browsing and trampling. Someone who knows the territory knows these animal patterns, anticipates where animals are likely to be at different times, uses animal trails when they're convenient, avoids areas where dangerous predators concentrate, reads animal signs as information about conditions and recent events. The deer trail that shows fresh tracks suggests deer are currently using this route, might be encountered along it, might provide hunting opportunity, or might be best avoided if hunting isn't the current goal. The wolf howls heard from a specific direction locate the pack, inform decisions about travel routes, create awareness that might prevent dangerous encounters. The bison trails that converge on water sources reveal where those sources are, even when they're not visible, provide routes to follow when direct knowledge is incomplete. This animal knowledge integrates seamlessly with knowledge of terrain, vegetation, water sources, all the other components of territorial understanding, creating complete mental models that capture the living reality of landscapes rather than just their static physical features. Plant knowledge similarly enriches territorial awareness. The berry patches that produce in late summer, the nut trees that drop their seeds in fall, the edible roots that grow in specific soil types, the medicinal plants that appear in particular conditions, the resinous trees that provide fire-starting materials. All of this botanical knowledge maps onto the physical territory, creating information about resources, about seasonal availability, about what can be gathered where and when. Navigation planning incorporates this knowledge. routes chosen to pass productive gathering sites when those sites are seasonally appropriate, detours taken to check on plant resources during the right seasons, places remembered not just for their physical features but for their biological productivity, for the resources they provide, for their value in the seasonal round of subsistence activities. Modern people navigating through landscapes often see just terrain, just physical features to cross or circumnavigate. Traditional people see resources, opportunities, the productive capacity that makes landscapes valuable rather than just difficult. This different way of seeing reflects different knowledge, different priorities, different relationships with landscape that come from direct dependence on local resources rather than from resource acquisition through market systems that obscure the connections between places and provisions, between landscape features and life support. The integration of all these knowledge types, spatial awareness, temporal patterns, animal behaviors, plant distributions, water sources, weather patterns, route characteristics, seasonal changes, resource availability, danger locations, creates comprehensive territorial understanding that enables sophisticated decision-making, flexible planning, adaptive responses to changing conditions. This is not just navigation knowledge, it's ecological knowledge, it's economic knowledge, it's survival knowledge, all integrated into unified mental models that represent territory as complex living system rather than as simple physical space to move through. Modern people often think of navigation as purely spatial problem, as simply knowing which way to go to reach intended destination. But traditional navigation integrates much more. It considers resources available along different routes. It accounts for seasonal conditions affecting different paths. It incorporates knowledge of animal movements and weather patterns and countless other factors beyond just spatial relationships. This richer concept of navigation reflects richer engagement with landscape, more complete understanding of how places work, more sophisticated awareness of the many factors that influence success or failure of travel and other activities that depend on moving through territory effectively. Teaching this kind of comprehensive territorial knowledge requires more than just explaining facts or showing maps. It requires extended apprenticeship, repeated experience, gradual accumulation of knowledge through observation and practice, and direct engagement with landscape across seasons and years. Children learning territory don't receive lectures or study guides. They accompany adults, watch what adults notice and do, ask questions when confused, receive explanations when they request them, gradually build their own understanding through participated experience rather than through abstract transmission of information. This learning process is slow, taking years or decades to reach expert levels, but it's also deep, creating knowledge that integrates with personal experience, that becomes part of how people see and interpret their environment, that shapes perception rather than just adding facts to memory. The knowledge becomes intuitive, automatic, available without conscious retrieval, shaping behavior below the level of deliberate thought. This is very different from modern education that emphasizes explicit learning, conscious knowledge, information that can be stated and tested and verified through examinations. Both approaches have value, but the traditional approach creates different kind of knowledge, more deeply embodied, more automatically applied, perhaps harder to transmit quickly, but more reliably available once developed, more integrated with actual behavior, more functional for direct application in real situations rather than for passing tests or demonstrating explicit understanding. Modern attempts to preserve or recreate traditional knowledge often struggle because they try to extract knowledge from its context, to record it in books or databases, to transmit it through explicit teaching divorced from the experiential apprenticeship that originally created it. The facts can be recorded, the details can be documented, but the integration, the automaticity, the embodied understanding that makes knowledge functional often resists this extraction, requires the original experiential learning process to develop properly, cannot be created through information transfer alone. This doesn't mean preservation efforts are worthless. Recording knowledge prevents complete loss. Documentation allows partial recovery. But it suggests that full transmission requires recreating the conditions that originally created the knowledge, requires extended engagement with landscape, requires learning through practice rather than just through study, requires commitment of time and effort that modern life often makes difficult, that competes with other demands and opportunities that may not receive the sustained focus necessary for deep learning unless circumstances create sufficient motivation to overcome the difficulties and sustain the effort through the years required for genuine mastery. The sleeping bodies shift occasionally, finding more comfortable positions, responding to cooling air as the night progresses toward its coldest hours. Those pre-dawn times when temperature drops lowest, when the previous day's heat has dissipated completely, when morning's warmth hasn't yet begun to build. Someone pulls a fur more tightly around shoulders, unconscious adjustment to thermal conditions, maintaining comfort without fully waking. This kind of automatic adjustment, responding to environment without requiring conscious awareness, represents another form of competence that develops through experience, through spending nights in varying conditions, through learning what works to maintain comfort, through practices that become automatic and no longer require thought. Modern people sleeping in climate-controlled bedrooms often lose this kind of thermal awareness, this ability to adjust to natural temperature variation, maintaining comfort through technology rather than through practiced adjustment. The loss seems trivial. Comfort is comfort, however achieved, but it represents another small reduction in self-reliance, another capability that atrophies when technology makes it unnecessary, another example of how modern life trades independence for convenience, capability for comfort, resilience for efficiency. The trade makes sense for most people most of the time, but it creates population-level vulnerability, creates dependence on systems that might not always function, creates lack of capability to manage without the technological support that modern life provides. Resilience is not romanticism about past ways of living. It's practical recognition that systems fail, that technologies break, that circumstances sometimes demand capabilities beyond what normal modern life requires. The person who can navigate in darkness when flashlight batteries die has advantage over the person who cannot. The person who can maintain comfort through clothing adjustment and activity level rather than depending on heating systems has advantage when power fails. The person who knows territorial resources through direct experience has advantage when supply chains disrupt. These advantages seem minor, almost negligible, when systems work reliably. But systems don't always work reliably. Disruptions happen. Emergencies arise, and when they do, the capabilities that seemed unnecessary suddenly become valuable, the skills that seemed obsolete prove functional, the knowledge that seemed irrelevant becomes critical. Developing these capabilities requires effort that competes with other priorities. Maintaining them requires practice that modern life doesn't naturally provide. But the effort creates not just practical advantage in emergencies, but also psychological security, confidence that comes from knowing one can manage in difficult conditions, from not being entirely dependent on systems outside personal control, from possessing capabilities that function regardless of whether technology works or systems remain operational. The balance between relying on systems, versus developing personal capability admits no universal answer, varies with circumstances and preferences and risk assessment. Full self-reliance is impossible for most people. Modern life requires too much specialized knowledge, too much division of labor, too much interdependence with others and with technological systems. No one builds their own computer, generates their own electricity, manufactures their own medicine, grows all their own food, produces all their own tools, creates all the countless things that modern life requires. Some dependence is inevitable. Some interdependence is necessary, but the degree varies. Some people develop more personal capability, maintain more independence, rely less heavily on systems that might fail. Others accept more dependence, optimize for efficiency when systems work, accept vulnerability when they don't. Neither approach is wrong, but the choice should be conscious rather than default, should reflect actual decisions about acceptable risk and desirable capability, rather than just happening through inattention and cultural drift toward increasing dependence, because that's what modern life makes easy and convenient and normal. Dark navigation skills represent one small piece of this larger question about capability and dependence, about what's worth developing and what's reasonable to outsource to technology. For most modern people, the effort required to develop genuine competence in dark navigation exceeds any benefit it might provide. Flashlights work well. Batteries are reliable enough. The occasions when navigating without artificial light becomes necessary are rare enough that accepting incompetence in those rare situations makes practical sense. But thinking about dark navigation, understanding what capabilities humans possess in potential, even if never developed in practice, reveals something important about the relationship between modern life and human nature, about what we've gained and what we've lost in the process of creating technologically advanced civilization, about the choices we've made, often unconsciously, about which capabilities to maintain and which to allow to atrophy, about what we think humans are capable of versus what we actually are capable of when circumstances demand and practice develops the potential that biology provides. This understanding might not change behavior, but it might change perspective, might reveal that limitations we take for granted are choices rather than inevitabilities, that capabilities we think are lost could be recovered if circumstances made recovery worthwhile, that human potential exceeds what modern life asks of us in most domains, that we're capable of far more than our comfortable lives require, that the easy life technology enables is wonderful and valuable, but also creates atrophy of capabilities that previous generations maintained because necessity demanded them. The darkness outside remains complete, absolute, in the sense that no light pollutes it, that no artificial sources illuminate anything, that natural darkness persists undisturbed by human intervention, except for the tiny glow of coals in this one shelter, tiny island of dim light in vast ocean of darkness that covers the landscape from horizon to horizon, that fills the valley and covers the hillsides and extends to the mountains in the distance and beyond to the edges of the world, however far those edges might be. Wherever this territory ends and others begin, the geography known only in the immediately surrounding area, and vague beyond that, known through travel stories and second-hand reports, and the kind of uncertain knowledge that exists beyond personal experience. This darkness is what night means without artificial light, what all night used to be before electricity, before gas lamps, before oil lamps even, back when fire was the only light source and fire went out or burned low and darkness returned fully, completely, without compromise. Modern people experience nothing like this. Even in rural areas, distant lights create sky glow. In cities, darkness is essentially absent. replaced by perpetual twilight of street lights and building lights and vehicle lights, creating artificial day that never completely fades. The circadian rhythms that evolved to respond to natural light and dark cycles get disrupted. Sleep patterns suffer, health consequences accumulate, but the convenience, the safety, the extended productive hours all seem worth the costs. The trade seems reasonable, and for individuals, for cities, for modern civilization, it probably is reasonable. The benefits outweigh the costs by most measures, but something is lost. Some connection to natural cycles, some experience of true darkness, some capabilities that darkness demanded. And whether that loss matters depends on values, priorities, assessments about what makes life good, what capabilities are important, what kind of relationship with nature is desirable, questions that have no universal answers, that different people resolve differently, that cultures answer through collective choices that shape individual options. The night continues toward dawn that will eventually arrive, that will bring light and warmth and visibility, that will make navigation trivial again, that will allow the easy movement that daylight provides, that will restore visual dominance and allow other senses to recede into supporting roles. But until then, darkness persists. And in that darkness, human life continues. Sleep happens. Dreams occur. Unconscious processing goes on. Memory consolidation and neural maintenance and all the mysterious activities that happen during sleep, that neuroscience understands only partially, that serve purposes not fully known but clearly essential given how much time mammals spend sleeping, how sleep deprivation degrades function so rapidly, how evolution has maintained sleep despite its apparent vulnerability, despite the danger of unconsciousness in environments with predators, despite the opportunity cost of hours spent inactive when those hours could be used productively. Whatever sleep does, it's important enough that evolution has preserved it, refined it, made it essential rather than optional. And it happens here, now, in darkness, in the shelter where the fire has dimmed to barely glowing coals, where the only sounds are breathing and the occasional shift of position, where peace settles over sleeping people who will wake when dawn comes, who will resume the activities that fill days, who will move and work and live in the endless cycle that repeats itself generation after generation, each day similar to the last and to the next, each night bringing the same darkness, the same sleep, the same rest that prepares for tomorrow's activities. This is not dramatic, not exciting, just life, just the daily rhythm that has always been, that will continue as long as humans persist, that connects us to ancestors extending back through time to the beginning of our species, that will extend forward through descendants as long as our species survives. The fundamental pattern of human existence that technology modifies but does not eliminate, that remains underneath all the surface changes, all the technological advances, all the cultural variations. We are still, fundamentally, the same creatures who lived here, who slept in shelters, who woke to darkness and navigated through it successfully, who possessed capabilities we no longer develop but still potentially retain, who adapted to natural conditions we've insulated ourselves from but could still manage if necessary. The connection remains. The potential persists. The capabilities await recovery if circumstances ever make recovery necessary or desirable. And in understanding this, in recognizing what we've lost and what we've gained, what we could do and what we do, we see ourselves more clearly, understand human nature more completely, recognize both our limits and our potential, our dependencies and our capabilities, the ways we've changed and the ways we remain constant despite all changes. This understanding might not change how we live, but it changes how we see ourselves, how we understand our place in nature, how we evaluate the trade-offs we've made, how we think about what's possible, what's lost, what could be recovered, what matters enough to preserve or restore or develop, even when modern life makes it unnecessary. And in that understanding comes possibility, potential, choice, rather than just acceptance of how things are. Awareness that opens doors to different ways of being, different relationships with capability and nature and self-reliance and dependence, different balances between ancient skills and modern technologies, different futures than the one default choices would create if we never examine them, never question them, never consider alternatives to the patterns that modern life makes easy and normal and default.